Black Friday.
Black Friday. It is Black Friday.
Ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to introduce our guest, Morgan Marietta. He's the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he teaches political psychology and constitutional politics. His research focuses on the political consequences of belief. He is the author of 4 books, most recently, One Nation, Two Realities, Dueling Facts in American Democracy, which focuses on the roles of facts and lies in politics. Professor Marietta, considering we're in the midst of a global pandemic, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. How are you holding up, sir?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. This is a great time to be talking about fact checking because people are very hungry for what I would call the false certainty of fact checking, but especially with everything going on about the pandemic, it's just one big example of all of the politics of truth surrounding it.
Right. And in your book, One Nation, Two Realities, you talk about the issue of dueling facts. Can you talk about what you mean when you say dueling facts and how exactly do facts duel?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that people confuse a lot is the difference between facts and truth. Truth is what really exists in the world, but from the beginning of philosophy, politics, we recognize we don't have access to truth. We don't have access to what we call facts, and facts are the best human approximation of the truth, but it's pretty faulty. We make a lot of mistakes, and we don't have a lot of access to it. Facts are the things that are supported by the best evidence and are endorsed by authorities in society. But those authorities aren't always right. So what we have about a lot of things is we have a situation where people want to believe that things are just facts, truth, and misinformation. And you can really tell which one's which. But that's not true. We have a lot of things that we simply don't know. They're just blurry realities. And people want to pretend that we know what's true, but we really don't. And that's why they duel. That's why they fight. I think what it really comes down to is people say there's those 3 little words that people don't say enough, but they're not "I love you." They're "I don't know." And about a lot of things, we don't know.
Exactly. There is a lot of things we don't know. And I've noticed that too. When you have conversations with folks will even reach and say like what they think it is versus just saying, I don't know. I'm stumped.
Yeah, we don't know. And experts disagree on things. Experts disagree about a lot of things. And when you get into political things, they really disagree. Yeah. The big ones we talk about in the book about dueling facts, climate change is the huge one. And there is a lot of scientific consensus on climate change, and there's a big but on that. If you ask, it depends on which question you're talking about. If you say, is climate change happening? There's a lot of evidence that's clear on that. If you start saying, well, did humans cause it? It's a little less clear. And if you ask the question, is there anything we can do about it? Now the answer is completely unclear. So when someone says it's a fact that climate change is happening and therefore we should do this, okay, now you're getting into different realm here. The actual scientific consensus answers to the question of is climate change happening? Did humans cause it? And is there anything we can do about it? Are not yes, yes, yes. They're yes, probably, and no. So that's where all of the difference comes in. And it's not just climate change.
You also said there's divide even amongst if racism is still an issue in America.
Oh, yeah. And exactly what influences, how prevalent it is, what causes it has, how that works. This came up at the Supreme Court. There was a PolitiFact on John Roberts at the Supreme Court. And this was about the Voting Rights Act. And the gist of it is the Supreme Court had to decide, is racism in the South still keeping African Americans from voting? And that's a great question. That is a serious question about how the law works and suppression of voting. And the Voting Rights Act was put in 1964 when it was really clear that racism was suppressing Black votes in the South. There wasn't any question about it. But the question is it still now? See, that's a little different. And then you got to look at what the experts say and what does the evidence say. And John Roberts, the Chief Justice, asked this really fascinating question during the Supreme Court arguments. And he said, tell me, Where are there higher rates of African American voting? Massachusetts or Mississippi? Now you might think, the answer to that question, it might be obvious, but it's not. It's actually the reverse. The voting rates in Mississippi among blacks are higher than the voting rates among blacks in Massachusetts. And then Roberts asked this question, okay, well, what data do we look at? How do we know the answer to this question? Is racism still suppressing votes? And it's not as simple when you start asking, how do we know this? How do we know that? Is there disagreement on these things? And how does all this work? But it's not just racism. It's not just climate change. It's about, is the national debt really influential or not? Experts are deeply divided on this. In the pandemic era, we just spent $3 trillion.
Right.
And there's this huge debate. Well, the pandemic is bad, really bad. How bad is the $3 trillion debt? And what's that going to mean? And how's that going to work?
That's true.
But there's all sorts of things. The effect of minimum wage, the effect of vaccines, where marijuana is harmful or not is this massive debate. That went to the Supreme Court also.
Oh, wow.
All sorts of things.
We're just argumentative by nature, it seems, huh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And these political things, these politically relevant things are just deeply divided like this. And hence the duel begins. But here's the real thing that Dave Barker and I at American University wrote One Nation, Two Realities. The big argument was not just about the existence of this. It's about why. It's about why people duel so much. Not just about things that are really not clear, but even things that are more clear, like climate change. And it's because people project their preferred values onto their perceived facts. People believe what they want to believe. And there's many different interwoven psychologies. On the cognitive psychology side of how our brains process wrong, on the social psych side that we agree with people in our social networks and we reinforce what our groups want us to believe, which doesn't really let us go against the values and beliefs of our group. And all these things interweave all in the same direction. People believe what they want to believe, which is also why fact-checking does not work. That's the basic reason fact-checking does not work.
Interesting. And as a remedy to those dueling fact checks, like you said, or those dueling facts, it's being proposed and it's being implemented now that fact checking is our best bet. And to that, you and others think otherwise. And what's led you to think otherwise?
Well, the book Lord of the Flies was something that a lot of people read back in high school. And it's really about this argument about reality. About what human nature is like. And the story of these boys who are shipwrecked on this island. And one of the first couple pages, Lord of the Flies, is a great quote where the boys don't want to believe what has happened to them. And it says, they were forced to believe in the reality of the island. The circumstances made them believe this thing that they didn't want to believe, that they were shipwrecked on this island. Fact-checking can't do that. Fact-checking does not have the power to force anyone to believe anything they don't want to believe. They don't have to read it. They don't have to trust it. If they do read it, all the psychology they can use to counter-argue it and throw it aside. It has no power to make people believe anything they don't want to believe. So they don't. And that's the problem with it. But I don't want to give the impression that it's just that people reject fact-checking for bad reasons.
Sure.
They reject fact-checking for good reasons. Fact-checking is not trusted for very clear reasons. The actual method that fact-checkers use is not consistent. It's not very legitimate. It has a lot of deep flaws to it. It has a lot of biases to it. And people get a sense of that. You don't have to be a social scientist to read some fact checks and think, this is pretty dodgy. And an ordinary person reads it and thinks, I don't really trust this. I read it and I can tell you that a lot of them are not trustworthy. So there are legitimate reasons that people don't trust the institution. And for an institution that claims to be reformist, they're trying to reform journalism and provide this kind of check on it. They're not very open to internal reforms. They do not reform themselves and reform their flaws. And that is limiting the degree of trust that people have in fact-checking. As long as people don't trust them, they're not going to work.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've seen a bunch of different studies that kind of look at fact checking, and you notice that the fact checkers tend to fact check conservatives far
Yeah.
more than liberals. Now, does that mean that Republicans or conservatives are liars, or they lie more? They have the tendency to lie more, or is, like you said, is there a bias at play?
This is one of the huge issues that causes the lack of trust on different sides on this. There's a really good book by a guy named Lucas Graves, who's a journalism faculty at Wisconsin, I think. Wrote the major study on fact checking. He used to work at PolitiFact, factcheck.org. And he makes a really clear argument on this that I think is completely right. That the industry itself, there's no question, all the studies on this say exactly what you say. They check conservatives and Republicans more often. They also find that they've been lying more often. But then the people who run the industry, this is true of PolitiFact, factcheck.org, then they back off and say, oh, well, we're not really making that judgment. We're not really saying that Republicans lie more. And that itself is not true. That if you're going to pretend that you're the great truth tellers, and you got to tell the truth, it's either that what you're saying is real, that Republicans lie more, or that you're biased and you check Republicans more and tend to find. So you got to decide which one it is.
Yeah.
And when people read it, yeah, obviously Democrats are going to think it's true and Republicans are going to think it's not. And one of the big problems here is, like the rest of mainstream journalism in the mainstream newspapers like Washington Post, New York Times, and the major media outlets, they are populated more by people who are on the American left than on the American right. And the people who read this thing, they know that this is true. It's not a deniable thing. That if you take the midpoint of American belief systems, left and right, the median American, journalists tend to be on the left of that. People know that. So the psychologists will tell you that it's really hard to avoid your own biases. And given that what their method is they pick things that sound like they might be lies. They sound fishy to them. So what sounds fishy to a liberal and what sounds fishy to a conservative are different things. So they're liable to think things sound wrong and then test them. And the people reading it know. So let me give you an example of how to understand this. If somebody who's more liberal in American politics and is saying, oh, no, these are professionals. I trust them because they're professionals. Mm-hmm. I'm a professional, but I don't trust myself. I don't trust other professionals. Professionals have biases too. Yeah. That's how this works. Right. If you said to a group of people who are Democrats, hey, the Heritage Foundation, which knows a right-wing think tank, or American Enterprise Institute, another right-wing think tank, 95% conservatives. They did this study, and they swear it is perfectly empirically excellent, and they followed all the social science standards, and they came to this conclusion. Do you trust them? And all the Democrats I know would say,
hell no.
Hell, I don't trust Heritage Foundation. What are you talking about? Yeah. And that's the New York Times. That's PolitiFact. That's factcheck.org on the other side. So conservatives aren't going to believe you. And especially if you start doing that dodgy thing that they do of, well, if you look at the numbers, we do say Republicans lie more, but we're not going to say Republicans lie more. We're not going to admit that that is true. And they all dodge in that way. Right. We could talk about some more about how some of the method things are flawed, but there's the one that you and I talked about before was that they frame questions in different ways. One of the great problems of fact-checking, if you read them over a period of time, you'll note that they frame a question about a factual assertion. Could this be true? And then they check evidence of could it be true. And if you ask something, if something could be true, you can find different evidence that maybe it could reasonably be considered to be true and conclude it's true. But if you ask the opposite question, could this be considered to be false? You'll find evidence that it could reasonably be considered to be false and conclude that it's false. And you'll find that many of the fact checks take a position at the beginning. Are they trying to check if it's true, or are they trying to check if it's false? And that shifts what they do, and it shifts how they come out. And until they have real consistency of methods, how do they ask their questions? Who counts as an expert? Do they go to both conservative and liberal experts? How do they truly have a standard that people can trust? People are not going to trust them for legitimate reasons. They lack legitimacy.
Interesting. If the science is in fact flawed, and they know it on both sides, why has misinformation and fact checking become this kind of like trendy thing that is heavily supported by journalists, politicians, and now even the tech industry with Facebook and Google or YouTube?
Hope. It's grounded more in hope than actual evidence. Let me be really clear on this. If you look at the studies in psychology, the studies in political science, everybody's clear on this in the published literature, that fact-checking does not work. It has very small effects in things like keeping some politicians from lying. It has other marginal effects, but its basic effect, can it change actually what people think? The answer is no. So why do people think it is the great answer? And I don't have a clear answer to that, but the only thing I can offer you is that it's hope. They just are hopeful because we live in difficult times. We have this tremendous polarization. We have this tremendous kind of conflict. The pandemic has frightened people in this way that they want to have this kind of false certainty. So some of it is just being overly hopeful, and some of it is hubris. Another problem, and this is a deep criticism of social science in my own profession, nobody wants to just say, I don't know. They want an answer. And this is a problem in scholarship. If you present a journal article or you present a book and you don't have an answer, that's a problem. People want you to conclude with an answer. One of the things about one age, two realities that Dave and I don't conclude optimistically because it's not optimistic. Fact-checking doesn't work. We don't have a correction to the dueling facts problem. And we shouldn't pretend that we do until we do. I don't like to be the purveyor of the false hope and the hubris and overclaim on these things, but I do believe that's what people are doing about this. It sounds good, but it ain't good.
Right. Yeah. Oh, man, last year, Mark Zuckerberg, in December, he was in front of Congress, cameras everywhere. He was center stage, basically to the world. And he was on record saying that in a democracy, it's important that people see for themselves what politicians are saying so they can make their own judgments. I don't think a private company should be censoring politicians or news. This was, of course, referring to political ads, not just posts by anyone or any user on Facebook. But less than a year later, Facebook is now one of the loudest voices against misinformation. Should users be able to see everything, fact or fiction, whether it's true or false, and make that decision for themselves? Or do you think that truth needs a referee?
Yeah, this is one where I want to try to clearly say that there is no expert knowledge or clear answer to that question. This is a true opinion. There are things that are more knowledge, and I can offer you a lot of evidence we've done from surveys and experiments. There's a lot of theory on this. This one isn't. This is actually an opinion because this is a trade-off. There's the idea that we can try through fact-checking and certain controls and certain censorship, we can try to control misinformation that has negative effects. But there's an argument on the other side here that people are really worried about freedom of expression, that worried about government censorship. And you got to weigh these two things. So I'm not the expert on how to weigh these things. That's a really true opinion political question. What I can say is that there is true reason to believe, based on all political theory and political history, that if you give people power to censor, they will abuse it. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good generalization, I think, in the history of man, and that will cause more lack of trust, more problems. Whenever we have had cases where government can control information, ours and other governments, it hasn't gone well. So Perfect case in point actually is with the pandemic right now, what happened in China. That once you have a system where you can control and give tremendous incentives for people to be quiet, they start censoring doctors, they start censoring the flow of information, and it has this tremendous set of negative effects. So I have my own personal opinions on this, but they're not better than anybody else's. This is a trade-off of concerns about freedom, liberty, flow of information. How bad you think that's going to be if we give Facebook control? You mentioned earlier about Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg's a businessman. He changed his opinion in all likelihood because he thought one would get him money, and then he thought the other one would get him money. He's a businessman.
Right.
That's not necessarily who we want to trust to decide things for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And to your point about, the censorship that's happening in China, you've heard about censorship in the Philippines during this time. There have been numerous amounts of people in India who have been, brutalized because of this pandemic. You hear a lot of dissenting voices kind of being marginalized, and which leads me right into my next question about even things happening here in America. In the midst of this pandemic, there have already been cases where doctors, activists, all have had content either flagged as false or removed from platforms altogether. And so my question to you is, do you think that fact checking can lead to, I know you've kind of touched on it briefly, but do you see that if this thing kind of gains momentum, there would be a lot more widespread censorship, almost used as weapons against dissenting voices?
Yeah, this is another one where I'm not sure that I want to start lying to you. That's again kind of a projection into the future. It is definitely a concern. There's no question that if we empower certain groups, either government or private, to censor things and decide what's true and not true, especially if they aren't fundamentally trusted. If we give it to a company that isn't really trusted, or we give it to certain fact checkers that aren't really fully trusted, or people think have these certain biases. Oh, I'll tell you one right now. This was just shocking to me that just came out about Twitter. There's an academic journal, a scholarly journal. I'm pretty sure it was JREP, Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. I'm not positive, but I think that's the one. It was about 3 weeks ago. JREP was banned off of Twitter. And some scholars started complaining about it. And they finally came back and they said on their Twitter feed after that Twitter had banned them based on some policy they had violated about what they said. Twitter wouldn't tell them why. Twitter wouldn't tell them what it was. But they took a scholarly journal offline, Twitter. Wow. And there's no way that you can appeal to these people. They do what they do. It's still a private company, Twitter and Facebook. They may not be fully able to do whatever they want in the future because the courts might start to declare them to be something that's imbued with a public interest. Just like utilities,
right.
Like phone companies and electric companies, we can control them a bit. And I think we're going to go in that direction. But you still have either government that we don't fully trust or business people we don't fully trust making these decisions who are not accountable. And that sounds like it's going to lead to problems. And so we have competing problems now. We have the problem of misinformation that's dangerous, and we have the problem of censorship that is dangerous. In the United States, in our history, in our political history, we're a very free nation historically about expression. It's one of the great constitutional values of the United States. So we probably will veer in that direction. We're probably going to have more liberty and more misinformation, if I had to guess. Now, is it better to have less of each, less liberty and less misinformation? People can start making their decisions, but I would go with more liberty and more misinformation if I had to pick right now. But that's just personal opinion. We have to balance these things and attempt to try to overcome them. But this is not a simple piece of business, because it is not just simply the case that we can say, oh, let the fact checkers handle it and people will listen to them. That is what is not going to happen.
Right. As we can see now. Yeah.
Yeah, I hate to be the purveyor of gloom on this. I
No,
always
no.
run into the problem that people want to hear a much more positive message to conclude, and we can fix it through fact checking.
Sometimes we just got to take it straight, man.
I like to think so. I like to think that as adults we can do that, and we can
Yeah.
say this will not work. We can not pretend that we know things that we don't know. We can say I love you and I don't know at the same time.
Right. Absolutely. Right. We just have to keep it 100 and, try our best to kind of meet in that middle ground where, like you said, we're not necessarily choosing between, liberty and whether or not, this particular article is 100% accurate. It's like the Lysol spray can, it says it kills 99%. There's still 1% that's there. There's a little bit left. So we're not going to eradicate all bacteria, all viruses. And so to think that, we're just going to eradicate misinformation from the face of the planet, I think we're overreaching.
That's right.
Yeah. So, which leads me into one of my last questions, and we were talking about this trust and how, like, if we don't trust the institutions, whether it's the media industry or media agencies, news agencies, or whether it's even the government, so to speak, fact checking the way it's performed today, it's creating that spirit of untrustworthiness, right? And trust is paramount in our society. Without it, we descend into chaos. And for people of color, trust in the government has at times throughout history resulted not only in abuses of power and ethical violations, but in, like, the case of the Tuskegee experiments over a 40-year period, trusting the expertise of the government led to legitimate preventable deaths, and that has scarred public trust in the American health system to this day. There are a lot of people who still refuse to go and get seen by doctors simply because they feel like the medical system is trying to kill them. Whether that's a conspiracy or not, it is genuine amongst our community. And so my question to you, I know I've been asking you a lot of questions that bring up a lot of opinion, and, you're very, studious and about the science and statistics. But my question to you as a political scientist, how do we repair the already eroding trust in American democracy and begin moving forward in a more unified way?
Yeah. The utter implosion of trust that has happened over the last couple of decades is really shocking. Every piece of data we have on this, all the evidence says that trust in the United States, trust worldwide, especially trust in minority communities. You mentioned about Tuskegee. That's a perfect example of how people think, oh, that was some historical thing in the past, but no. People still don't trust people who gain too much power and can control things. This is one of the great problems of all social science, is how to restore trust. And the real truth is we don't have good answers on this. We know that we're very polarized as a society, and we're polarized in our partisanship and ideology and religion and geography and what kind of media we use and every other kind of polarization. Of course, polarization of our belief in facts, perception of facts. The more polarized we are, the less people trust each other. This is known in social science. When people are polarized, they don't trust each other. How to reverse the polarization is not known. How to increase the trust is not known. It is a great social science question. One small thing that I can say, maybe I can try to be a bit hopeful on this.
Give us some hope, man. Give us some hope.
I was just talking to a colleague of mine teaching psychology at University of Montana, and he was saying he's desperately trying to come up with hopeful things as well, and it's so difficult to do in the current day. One thing I can say is that transparency does lead to trust. This is known. The more transparent things are. You mentioned about the Tuskegee example. So many examples like that. Once it comes out, people always face the same question. Do we hide it to maintain trust? Or do we let it out and talk about the flaws and the history in order to gain and build trust. It's always the second. It's always the second that works. Over the long term, it's always the second. So with fact checkers, what should they do? They should be transparent about their methods. They should be transparent about the questions that they ask. They should be transparent about right now, they don't have public methods. They claim they do, but they do not. They do not have a clarity in exactly what sources they go to and why. I've publicly advocated that they should not just pick quietly, are they asking, could this be considered true or could this be considered false? They should do both in the same fact check. They should say, if you ask, could it be considered true? What's the evidence? Could it be considered false? What's the evidence? And if they have to come to a conclusion that, well, we just can't decide, we have to say it's murky, then be honest and say it's murky. Don't fake it for the people. Be as transparent as possible. Last thing I could say on this, universities have lost a great deal of trust. There's some really shocking polling that I encourage everybody to look at over the last couple of years about how much trust in universities to be purveyors of knowledge has gone down. And it's especially gone down among conservatives, among Republicans, for exactly the reason that we mentioned earlier. Conservatives, Republicans are aware that universities are populated by about 90% people who are on the left. So in political science, it's all the good studies, by the way, the clear studies that social scientists have done of universities, it's about 5 to 1. Liberal to conservative is about 5 to 1 across the scope of academia. But it varies a lot. Most of the conservatives are in the sciences, they're in business schools, some econ. You go to political science, it's 10 to 1. You go to sociology, it's 40, 50 to 1. And people aren't going to trust anything that is that biased in one way. Because you can pretend that professionals rise above their biases, but no one who has ever studied psychology believes that. Nobody rises above their biases. Not me, not you, not professionals, not anybody. So if universities are more balanced ideologically, if they're more open about what they do, if fact checkers were more balanced ideologically, if they were more open about what they did and they really were willing to be transparent. The only thing I can tell you, I know that transparency leads to trust. I know trust is incredibly down. I know we're all suffering because of it. I don't know how to fix it, but I hope that the great minds figure it out, better minds than mine. Maybe you'll figure it out. And and I hope people go the transparency direction. I wish I was more, I wish I were more optimistic. I really do.
Well, I appreciate your realism. We all appreciate your realism. And I thank you for joining us. This is Morgan Marietta, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he teaches political psychology and constitutional politics. You can check out his book, One Nation, Two Realities, Dueling Facts in American Democracy. Thank you again, sir.
Thomas, thank you very much.